So we're going to make a start by just having a short presentation now, and then having more conversation and plenty of opportunity to ask questions as well. So how I got into adventures, and it's really a lot of people you read books by men about polar adventures, you read books about adventures all over the world, and quite often they start right in the middle of something gnarly, some near-death experience, and it never really explains how they came to be in that world, how they became an adventurer, how they kind of navigated their way to that point. So, and I think it's really important to touch on that, because it's not straightforward. It's a lot of hard work, and it doesn't kind of happen overnight either. So, I want to say that this picture on the right of me on the left, in a dodgy floral toweling swimsuit from the 70s, is the start of my happy adventure career. But I really hated it when I was younger. We went on a lot of holidays to the Lake District. We went walking on Dartmoor, and honestly, I really did not enjoy it. But obviously, there was something planted a seed that eventually one day I did come back to. So after that, I did kind of what everybody expected you to do. I had a family and a career, but I never really kind of thought about what it was that I wanted. You kind of just fall into doing what everybody does. But I believe that it's like there's one novel and everyone who knows he's writing one, but I believe there's one big adventure in every heart, and it's just a matter of finding out what that is for you. So, and then this is a bit about how I became the picture on the right, which is now as a polar guide, expedition manager. I now share that experience of expedition life and polar travel with other people. So I'm very, very fortunate to do so. And this is a little bit about how that came about. So I had an expedition plan, and bearing in mind I had absolutely no experience or skills in this area. I didn't know that polar travel was something people did. I had no money, 4 children, a full-time job, and I couldn't even ski. I met a team that was skiing across Antarctica, and read a few polar history books, and just became completely hooked on this idea of going and doing something in Antarctica. And I looked at absolutely every possible way. I looked at jobs with British Antarctic Survey. Not very easy if you've got an English degree and have sort of done lots of writing. There's not much call for that. I looked at, can I go down on a ship? But the team that I actually went down to, the team that I ended up supporting as an expedition manager, when they went down, their team leader, who's actually standing in the room tonight, said, think big, why don't you go and do a journey in Antarctica, an expedition? And I thought, there's no way I could ever do something like that. I just haven't got the first clue how to go about that. There was a real chasm of nothing, in terms of my kind of experience and my skills and my ambition to go and do a journey to poles. So I really had to do a lot of basically building a polar CV. So to go and do a solo journey in Antarctica is a pretty big undertaking, and they want you to have gone and done various expeditions, had some experience at very low temperatures, lots of camping on snow, crevasse rescue, and actually learn all the things about navigation and using the cooker and melting the snow and what do you eat, and there's just a huge amount to do. So this is one of those pictures is me after trying to learn to ski for 2 weeks. And I put that in there because it really wasn't a matter of me just kind of swanning in and thinking I'm going to do this and finding it all very easy. It was definitely a struggle, and I did that 2-week trip thing, and by the time I got to the end of that journey, that 2 weeks in Norway, I thought there's absolutely no way I can do anything harder than that, because I was pretty crap at that. And so, how on earth am I going to? But the trouble with that is I'd already committed by telling a lot of people that I wanted to go and do this big polar journey. And once you've told a lot of people about your expedition idea, the cat's out of the bag, and it's quite hard to sort of put that back in. So I was on this road whether I liked it or not. And my aim was to try and go ski solo unsupported, from the coastline of Antarctica to the geographic South Pole, which was a journey of 720 miles, completely on my own with no external resupply, so you take everything, all your kit and equipment with you in your sled, in your polk, and that's it, you're on your own until you reach the South Pole. So it was another case of where my ambition completely outweighs my technical ability. But in a very sort of edited highlight, I did actually make it to, I reached the South Pole on the 8th of January 2020, and I did it in 42 days. And it's quite important because I'll come back to that later. But it was definitely not an easy journey. I've got a few additional facts which Nick and I separately decided would be quite useful for this evening. So only the 7th woman in history to do that journey, but 622 people have been to space, versus only 439 people who've ever skied to pole. Only 70 of those were solo, 12 men have walked on the moon, as we know, and only 10 women have ever skied solo to pole, so it really gives you an idea of the tiny numbers. And that, I thought, was going to be the end. So if anyone here has done a marathon or an expedition, that was definitely not something that I should have thought would be the case, because anyone who's ever been on anything like that, actually it has the reverse effect. You know, you come back from something like that, you recover, and there's certainly a bell curve of sort of pain and time where you kind of eventually get to a point where you're like, oh, that wasn't that bad, and I'd quite like to go back and do something else. But I didn't know that was going to be the case. I thought I'd ski to pole, tick that box, hang up my skis, and kind of go back to my day job. Unfortunately, going back to your 9 to 5 after a trip like that is more difficult than you might imagine. And while the world hadn't changed, I'd kind of changed while I was away, and fitting back into that place where I was quite tricky. So that didn't last very long. You know, I wasn't. And now I'm very fortunate that I'm out a lot of the time actually on expedition, sharing that with other people. But so I left this slide intentionally blank, like on an exam paper, without pretty pictures. And so the end of the beginning was clearly not the end of the story. So what kind of draws you back to something that's pretty brutal and quite awful a lot of the time? I was skiing for 10 to 12 hours a day. I'd put my tent up at the end of the day, and I'd be so exhausted I'd be doing it on my hands and knees because I hadn't got any more energy to kind of do anything else. Every morning I'd be crying in my tent thinking I can't get out and ski another day. So, you know, the fact that it was so awful a lot of the time, and I would never actually say it was fun. There might have been 2 or 3 days out of 40 odd that I would consider to be satisfying. You know, I kind of felt like I'd completed the day with the job well done. So what on earth draws you back to something like that? And anyone that's read any kind of polar history will know that Shackleton, you know, he kept going back. He ended up spending 9 years in total in Antarctica. And sort of once you've been, I think there are a few people in this room that have kind of been, or you know, you've got that far. And anyone that's ever been to Antarctica will tell you that it has this draw. But what on earth is so great about being in the most isolated, windiest, driest, most inhospitable place on earth, you know? And I really think of it like this. So, you know, it's cold, it's down to minus 40 plus wind chill. A nice day was sort of minus 15, minus 20. And you get extremely good actually about just sticking your head out the tent. You don't even need a thermometer to be like, oh, it's this temperature today and this is what I need. But obviously extremely cold. But where there's cold, you know, any place that you've been that's, or you can think of that's sort of the Arctic, the North, and also Antarctica, where there's cold, there's pristine beauty and wilderness. And, you know, we've all seen the David Attenborough footage, even if you've not been able to go, that you have this kind of, while it is extremely inhospitable, it's also incredibly beautiful. And there's deprivation, so you only have what you've brought with you. There's absolutely no kind of, there's very little contact with the outside world. There's no chance of changing your mind about what you've brought to eat. You've got literally one set of clothes. I think I had one set of clothes and 5 pairs of socks for the entire journey. And so, you know, it's extremely kind of, it's almost monastic, and it's in the way that you've got to live. But actually that sort of simplicity of living is really quite, it's almost addictive. And, you know, it's a sort of Barack Obama sort of theory of having 5 of the same shirts, and appropriately for tonight, but, you know, having the same outfit for 5 days takes away the need to make other decisions, and it actually gives your mind this kind of freedom to sort of think about other things. You find yourself thinking about all sorts of things when you're on your own in a place like that you might not have thought about for years. And it's got this really kind of intensely simple quality where we've left behind all the other sort of day-to-day trappings of life, and that's definitely a draw. And then the isolation. So there's a great pub fact, whether or not it's ever actually true, but it could potentially be true, that the nearest other person in Antarctica when you're on a solo journey could be in the International Space Station. And that gives you an idea of just how isolated it is. You know, it's this completely vast continent with very little in it. And it could actually feel quite isolating. And certainly on the first journey, I never felt lonely, although I was alone. But where there's isolation, there's also this incredible solitude, which we very rarely get to experience. So those things combined, despite it being sort of quite horrendous at times, really kind of draws you back into this just incredible place. So the She Who Dares expedition, which I think we're going to sort of dip into a bit more this evening, I'm just going to talk about the expedition because this was the one that specifically Thomas Pink was in support of. And I've said that women are made from, well, it's men are not made from easy victories but great defeats, but forgive me, I've added it into so it's women as well. But my expedition was called She Who Dares. And the objective was, so the background was I did this solo journey, and I did it in 42 days. And the idea was to go and try and break the women's speed record for the fastest solo unsupported journey to pole, which I thought would be quite straightforward because by my slightly dodgy maths, that's only 7% faster than I'd skied before. So, you know, that was pretty doable if I'd trained at least 7% harder and prepared 7% better. And so the record stood at 38 days, 23 hours and 5 minutes at the time. So that was my aim, and it was kind of a pretty simple sort of proposition, and it was called She Who Dares because I just love the fact that it was kind of a spin on He Who Dares, and you know, we dare each other as kids to do things, but how often do we dare ourselves and then go ahead and sort of attempt it? So definitely it was as much about the endeavour as it was about the outcome. But obviously I trained and prepared to the kind of nth degree with the idea that I was going to break this record, and I totally believed that I would. Oh, so that's me in Punta Arenas, looking pretty pleased with myself actually, about to fly into Antarctica for my record attempt. But pretty much everything that could have gone wrong with this expedition did go wrong, and you know, I think we will talk about it sort of in conversation as well. But I got really sick at the logistics base before I'd even set out. I had a lot of gear failures. There's this thing called sastrugi, which is sort of wind-blown peaks of ice, which you generally get sort of closer to the South Pole, but was just because of the nature of the season, there was a lot of it much lower down, and that caused me a lot of sort of issues in terms of being able to keep up with the pace and just kind of falling over all the time and getting knocked about a bit by Antarctica generally. And certainly on the first journey, I always felt like I had a relationship with place, that Antarctica had let me in and allowed me to do my journey. And it felt like the complete opposite. You know, it felt like Antarctica was trying to tell me that I shouldn't be here. And after 14 days, so 300 odd nautical miles, I made the decision to stop the expedition. I'd become quite unwell. It was quite clear that I wasn't going to get the record. And actually, I was okay with that. So the decision to stop was actually not the most difficult thing. You know, once I made that decision, it actually felt like the easiest thing in the world and completely the right thing to do, because it felt like actually, and when a small problem often becomes a much bigger problem in a place like that. And so I wasn't happy that I would make good decisions because I was just so depleted and exhausted. So it was definitely the right call. This is me on when I got dropped off. And I actually didn't take a single other photo for the remainder of the 14 days of the expedition because I was having such an horrendous time that I couldn't sort of get my head around doing, you know, nice sponsor photos or, you know, documenting it. I just was feeling absolutely kind of I was in a pretty dark place actually. So but I got picked up by a plane very similar to this and taken back to Union Glacier. And then once I recovered, I was very lucky that I was able to go and climb Mount Vinson, which is Antarctica's highest mountain. So definitely kind of something good came out of it in the end. And I wanted to briefly touch on some early lessons really, because I definitely thought that I kind of knew everything before I went into that for that second journey. And I did all these talks about all these things that I learned, and actually kind of I was really humbled by Antarctica, by the conditions and by everything that happened on that journey. But I can honestly say that I learned more on those 14 days on the second expedition where everything was going wrong. than I did when everything was going pretty much swimmingly on the first expedition. So I just wanted to talk about facing your fears, and I know we're going to talk briefly or extensively later on about that. And I think the biggest thing for me on the first expedition and this expedition was the biggest thing that I was afraid of wasn't dying, it was actually not succeeding. So when that actually happened on the second expedition, it was a really it was rock bottom in a way. I'd failed, and to be able to face what you're kind of most afraid of in that way and realise that the world didn't end, it wasn't a complete disaster. And I was pretty quickly able to reframe that and bounce back and start thinking about, well, what have you learned from this that you can apply in future, or where's this going to take you, or how the things that you've learned are going to shape what you do next. So I think that's a big part of resilience, and we could do a whole sort of evening really on resilience, but being able to take what's happened to you and make it into something that is something that you learn and be able to apply moving forward is actually kind of a really important part of a toolkit for expedition life and kind of everyday life as well, I think. So that for me was definitely a lesson. And it also taught me really what was truly important, because yes, expeditions are incredible, and being in this incredible landscape and doing something really quite extremely demanding and difficult and awful as well at times. That's all very well, and that's all well and good, but actually when I did take the decision to stop, I had this outpouring of love that I kind of never knew was out there for me and for the mission. And so many people messaged me to say this is the right decision, we're totally behind you, sponsors, friends, family, total strangers. And that made me realise actually what's important is our relationships with people and the people we love, and not expeditions. That's just kind of almost a vehicle for realising that. And so that was kind of a profound lesson for me when I was sat there waiting for pickup. And the last thing I wanted to touch on was before Nick and I chat a bit more was just that it's unfinished business. So, and I don't know if that is the kind of the affliction of adventure, but certainly I feel like there's something else. This Antarctica will get me back to do something in future. But as I was saying to Nick earlier, that the danger always is actually voicing those ideas, because when people say what's next and you say something and people say, oh wow, that sounds exciting, before you know it, it's become an expedition. It's got a sort of momentum of its own. So I'm almost afraid to say anything on those lines, but I've got a few ideas which we might delve into. And now we're going to have a nice chat, Nick.
We certainly are. This was the time of Shackleton, Scott, Charcot, Amundsen, these great names. And they all had one thing in common. They all looked like me. They didn't have such a magnificent shirt as I've got on, but they did look like me. And you know what I mean by that. And fast forward 100, 120 years, and increasingly we are seeing different types, more diversity within the exploration community. Now we come on to whether it's exploration, adventure, sport, expedition, or any of those things later. Which sort of makes me think, oh, well, that's all right then. It's all nice and even, and it's all nice and balanced. Please tell me I'm right.
Well, I don't know what everyone in the room thinks, but it definitely isn't nice and balanced. The vast majority of people going on these types of adventures are people who have they're allowed by the nature of their kind of upbringing to go and try these things, and if it all fails, there'll be a safety net. Someone's going to pick them up at the end of it. Primarily, it's white middle class, public school educated men, but there's plenty more room for a more diverse cohort. But I think it's almost like a vicious circle that people don't see those role models. They don't see it's for them, and so they don't kind of think that that's their world. So there's definitely more work to be done. It's getting better, and the first woman didn't reach the South Pole. There was a group led by Lois Jones in 1969, after Amundsen reaching the pole in 1911, and it was longer between Amundsen reaching the pole and a woman reaching the pole than the first woman in my expedition. But the pace of change in that regard is accelerating, but we're not equal yet.
Right. This is the last time I'm going to call you a Monmouthshire mum, but there's a reason for this, because as a journalist it offends me, it's such lazy journalism. But nobody said when was it, 1995, when Penhado got to the North Pole, nobody said Dorset Dad, did they? And when Ranfines does whatever Ranfines gets up to, they don't call him well, probably do, but that's not for now. But what I'm trying to say is that the newspapers haven't really been your friend here. Now, is this something that you can sort of shrug off and say, well, they're bound to do that, aren't they? But at least I'm taking a step in the right direction, or does it really make you feel up?
I think initially when I first started approaching the media, I did kind of feel fed up. It should be, person skis to pole, not mum does this or mum does that. But actually, that's the point of interest that people pick up on. That the fact that it's unusual for a woman, the fact that it's very much more unusual for a mother to go and do these journeys, is something that needs to be part of the conversation. And the fact that that's what people are always drawn to is what we need to kind of keep talking about, and to make it as completely normal for a mum to go and do these trips. And so the headline will never be that again. But while it is, I think this, it's kind of that's part of my life's work, if you like.
Yeah, and I remember Anne Daniels on Woman's Hour, who I believe is the mother of triplets, trying to explain to the presenter that she wasn't just the little girl, isn't she clever for a woman on this trip? She was the navigator. She was leading Martin Hartley and Penhado through whiteouts and all that sort of thing. And the presenter more or less said, well, that's nice, dear.
Anne Daniels is a friend of mine, and she's another amazing trailblazer in this world. But it is such a small handful that I could probably name all of them on the fingers of one hand.
Well, it's Felicity Aston as well, isn't it?
Name another.
Well, I probably could, but we have to move on. Now, I take your point entirely. It's exactly the same with name a woman engineer or something like that. We've discussed this before. But I think that one of the things that we should really talk about this evening is motivation. And I've divided the topic up into two types of motivation, although I'm sure there are plenty more. There's the sort of external motivation of why you're doing it. And historically, it's been maybe for scientific discovery or for geopolitical reasons, to grab some land before somebody else grabbed it, or it was to show off by being the fastest, or to make money, or to steal something. And there's a lot of reasons for exploring. And these are what I call the external reasons. Then the internal reasons, which is why are you doing it for yourself? And I think you've covered some of that in what you just said there. But whatever the reason, you have to attract interest from the outside world to do it, don't you? So you need an external reason. So what was yours? Was it the record, or
it's so interesting. It was a combination of things, but I wanted to go and do a trip in Antarctica, and it didn't really matter at the time what that was. And so I had this grandiose idea about, I want to go and pioneer a new route to pole, and it involved a big team, and I had a filmmaker, and I had a medic, and it was going to be amazing. But actually it didn't really mean anything to anyone who wasn't kind of in that world, because pioneering a new route, well, kind of so what? And I went to see a good friend of mine called Ghazala Mir, who's married to Roger Mir, and Roger Mir did an incredible journey in the 80s called In the Footsteps of Scott, where they went and overwintered in the kind of traditional way, and it was an absolutely kind of epic expedition. And he said to me, why do you want to go? And I said, I want to do some science, and I want to pioneer this new route. And he was like, no, why do you want to go? I was like, I'm just obsessed with Antarctica. I can't get it out of my brain. I'll do anything to get there. And he said, make it about that. And it became a solo trip, because I honestly didn't think that there was anybody else out there who was as kind of absolutely driven and determined as I was to kind of get to this place. And so and after I changed the sort of remit of the expedition, the objectives, it kind of all fell into place, and I had my first sponsor within a week. So my kind of internal motivations were very much about it's about Antarctica, rather than trying to do something sort of fast is because you can end up slicing it so thinly that I'm the first woman with size 5.5 feet with 4 children. And where do you draw the line with that? But for me, it was just about somehow getting to this incredible place, and that was how I was going to do it. And it kind of made sense because it was always about me in Antarctica, and being able to be in Antarctica with just kind of experience that alone was quite fitting, I think.
Perhaps we should change direction completely for a moment, which is that we're sitting in the street which is more famous, I think, for its tailoring than for exploration, although I expect one or two explorers have been down here to get themselves kitted out for their evening wear. Now, this raises a very interesting question, isn't it? Because the luxury brand community and the exploration community have always had this relationship. And we were talking about this before the microphones went on. If you go back to Herbert Ponting's photographs of the Terra Nova expedition, which somebody helped me, 1907, 1909, something like that, you have these fantastic black and white photographs, plate photographs, by one of the most famous photographers of the era. And he was putting these explorers on boxes with the word Cadbury's on, or Heinz or something like that. There was product placement everywhere on the Terra Nova expedition, and I think there would have been on Endurance and on Nimrod and that sort of thing. But there were whiskey bottles, there was champagne and that sort of thing. So there's this long, Charcot's the best one. He was sponsored by Mum Champagne, wasn't he? He was friends with George Mum. So you've got this long-standing association between luxury brands and exploration. My question, you've got the hard bit now, is why do you think that for a century you've had that? Why do you think shirt makers, champagne makers go to the exploration community for their inspiration?
Yeah, I think it is interesting, and I think it's quite nice in a way to know things haven't changed that much. That Shackleton went to with cap in hand to luxury brands, and one of his the famous lifeboat that he went to Elephant Island on with his men was called the James Kerr because he was one of his sponsors. So this idea of luxury brands and expedition and exploration really do go together, I think, because there's definitely an element of the pursuit of excellence, of trying to do things differently, and appealing to kind of living your life differently and doing things that are meaningful. And I think there is definitely some kind of obvious tie in there.
I think there's a tie in there that is going to carry on, because I think that what happens is that brands such as the one that we're enjoying here tonight can't really express, if you like, how daring they are in a fancy London street. The sort of the limitlessness of their imagination and that sort of thing. So it's quite nice to put those ideas into the mouth of an explorer. It's also really good to see to map the progress of excellence as well. And I think that when I think of your expeditions, I don't really differentiate between the two, as one as being successful and the other one as being a failure. But maybe it's a good time to talk about failure.
For sure.
Yeah, okay. So just so that nobody feels that I'm picking on Wendy, I'm not. If you look at the expedition, didn't get to the pole. Endurance, the ship sank. And Quest, he died. So on a sort of top level, we could, if we wanted to be rude about Shackleton, say, well, he didn't really succeed in anything. But that's not true, is it? Now, I think that out of failure, Shackleton became perhaps one of the most important explorers of that heroic era. You did the same thing as he did on Nimrod. You turned back to be somebody who lived to tell the tale. What does it feel like, that moment where you say, nah, it's not going to happen?
I think that actual moment of making the decision was the easiest thing that I'd done, because there were so many sort of things going wrong that it was really the obvious kind of decision. But I think the nature of challenge and failure is quite interesting, because if you're not failing, then almost like the challenge isn't big enough, and the very nature of challenge is something that you don't know whether you can definitely complete, because if you knew that you could run to the end of the street, well, that's not much of a challenge, you know. It's definitely somewhere in that space of completely impossible, and you know, just kind of exploring what the boundaries are and what we're capable of as human beings, but also what you're capable of individually, and how much you can push that before you're in a dangerous place, you know. And there's kind of so much that we can learn from life and from about ourselves when we're in that sort of space between what we know we can achieve and what we're aiming to achieve. I think that's where the sort of magic happens.
Well, I was hoping that you were going to develop the idea earlier about reframing objectives, because once Shackleton knew that the Endurance was never going to sail home, it was beset in ice. It no longer became about getting to the pole, it became about getting home. There were no telephones in those days, there was no postal service. If you wrote a letter on the ship, it wouldn't get home for 2 years. So something had to be done. And so, of course, the idea was, where's the nearest radio? Oh, I know, 800 miles away in Grytviken. So somehow he had to get his men into a situation where they could survive, so that they could go and get a radio signal to someone to come and collect them. It was not an easy thing that he did, and this is what we remember him for, this reframing of his priorities, isn't it? So it doesn't mean that the expeditions failed, does it, just because you turn back?
I don't think so, and I think that ability to kind of refocus, so his original plan was to do a full traverse of the Antarctic continent, which is still to this day never been done, but when his ship sank, and he had to then find kind of get to safety, his objective switched 180 from doing this amazing journey to actually just kind of keeping everyone safe. And the fact that he was able to do that and make that kind of have that mental agility and make that change meant that all of his men actually survived. Whereas if you think about Scott and his arrival at Pole second to Amundsen a few weeks later, and how much his kind of morale just disappeared as soon as he realised he hadn't come first. And then his objective to get back, sort of, he didn't make that switch, and so his expedition ended up in the ultimate failure of his whole team dying. And comparing that to Shackleton, where he was able to just completely set aside, okay, well, that hasn't gone right, but you know, what's the next priority? And that definitely has a crosses over from expedition life to everyday life as well.
Before we throw it open to the floor, I'd like to discuss one last thing with you, which is, it's a bit abstract, which is, what does it all mean? What's the value of this? Now, I think that different explorers, adventurers, expedition leaders, whatever you want to call this group of people who undertake such marvellous endeavours, extract different meaning from it. And I suspect that yours is in this kind of transferable area where you inspire other people to become better versions of themselves. After all, that's exactly what you did with your first expedition, wasn't it? So can you tell everyone in the room what this is, this meaning that you've managed to get out of these experiences?
Wow, what does it all mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
We didn't discuss this before.
well, it's actually point 10. It's called Inspiration and Outreach.
I think, it's not almost for me to say what it means. It's about kind of almost what it means to other people. And I think what I've come to realise is that people say it's inspiring because they see me as, I definitely think that expeditioners, explorers, whatever you want to call them, are not superhuman. Some are more happy to be sort of very open about that, and I definitely am. And I think it's the fact that I've come at it quite a bit later in life, that I've come from a sort of very ordinary background. I didn't have any of those skills, but there was something in there, some sort of drive to kind of do something epic. do something that was kind of, that one big adventure. And I think people think, well, if she's done it, maybe I can do it. And I didn't wake up one day and have done all these things. You actually kind of you do it by like sort of climbing a staircase, if you like, of something that's a little bit harder, but not up here. You do something and then you think, oh, well, I did that, even though I didn't think I could, because you're in that sort of space. And then you think, well, maybe I could do the next thing and the next thing. And you eventually, you think, you kind of feel a bit scarily invincible. You think, well, you know what? Why shouldn't I go and try that? And when we were talking about what's next, I think when I climbed Mount Vincent, which is one of the 7 summits, so there's 7 the highest mountains in each of the 7 continents in the world, and I said to some people who were completing their 7 summits bid when I was in Antarctica, I said, oh, how many of the summits do you do before you kind of reach that tipping point of, well, you may as well carry on? And they said, oh, 1. So, I think it's probably a life's work. Now at sort of almost 46, that I'd love to complete the 7 summits one day and do North Pole like you, Nick. So have that kind of complete sort of set, if you like. So yeah, that might be something.
But will you have time to do all that, because you spend a lot of time going out into schools and giving inspirational talks, and that's what I think I was really talking about. What does it mean? This idea of being a role model. Because so many people get told that you can't fulfill your dreams, that's for other people, you can't do that. But you're the living, sort of breathing example that you can. Do you like being a role model?
I kind of don't see it as that. I'm there to kind of push the message, if you like, which is, you can have a dream, that's all very well, but you also need a plan, and you kind of need to take that first step and do it kind of today. And then get on with it, and don't ever sort of think, oh, I'll do it when I'm ready, or I'll do it when the kids are older, or I'll do it when I've got the money. You have to kind of set a date and work towards it, and that's kind of the only way to make it happen.
Isn't that the definition of being a role model? Right. So I think that you deserve a minute off. I think we have some time. Is anybody going to nod and say yes? I'm definitely getting a nod from the back. So you can't cover everything, can you, in half an hour? And you don't want to go on for too long, because you don't want people to think that it's too technical or too detailed. But you're always inevitably going to miss something. So if you feel we've missed something, don't ask me, ask Wendy.
Okay.
You mentioned that you had limited contact with the outside world on the first trip, the 42 days. Can you explain what you mean by limited contact, and what did you do for presumably the other 23 point whatever hours of every day when you had no contact at all with anybody at all, particularly given that we're so connected to everything all the time, always?
So yeah, I had you have sat phones and sort of multi-layers of safety communications equipment, and you have to check in with the logistics team once every 24 hours. And I had my exhibition manager, Louis, who's over there in the fancy new shirt, and I was talking to him every night as well. But yeah, you're right. The rest of the time, you're kind of, a lot of the time you're in your own head. You're playing these mental games, like if anyone's done anything longer than sort of a mile run, you play this mental game of, when I get to the next hedge, I'll look at what time I'm on or how many miles I've done, or when I get to mile 18, I'll have a jelly baby, or whatever it is. You're kind of playing that game with yourself pretty much all day. But I was also heavily reliant on audiobooks as well, and that kind of helped sort of pass the time.
I think we're all intrigued to know what audiobooks you were listening to.
So a lot of Ben McIntyre, which is weird, because he writes a lot of military history, and that's kind of not my thing, to be honest, but something about the way he tells the story, you're kind of on a sort of journey with him. And I've listened to Rogue Heroes about the history of the SAS, and I had a very limited number of audiobooks, and once they ran out, I then was stuck re-listening to the ones that I hated the least, and that was kind of, I ended up like listening to that 3 or 4 times. It's fantastic. So he feels like my kind of expedition partner in a funny kind of way.
Did you ever just enjoy the silence of it?
So I thought I was going to do that and be sort of immersed in the environment and in the moment and present and all of that stuff. But when I tried it, I felt like I was actually going mad. I just, it was too difficult just to be on your own in your own head for such a long period of time. And once you switch on to music or audiobooks, you can't go back. So, yeah.
Sort of following on from your question, I have many questions, to be honest, but if we're trying to tie a few of them into the same one, is spending that time alone with yourself and your thoughts. I mean, there's the whole like psychological part of how humans are a sort of like, we need each other's company. That's kind of like hive mind thing, just like being with each other, needing each other. How long did you say it was? Like 35, 40 days?
42 days, the first expedition.
42 days. I know very, very loose, well, I say facts, I've heard very loose facts whether they're true or not. But, okay, Everest, so many people have died climbing Everest. I wonder if I could tie two questions in. How many people have died going to the South Pole? And also, is the point of like the South Pole actually like the middle? Because I heard that there's a large portion of it that hasn't even been discovered. So my question really is how much of the spiritual journey were you sort of allowed to go on? Did you allow yourself to go on that? Was the spiritual journey perhaps afterwards when you finally got to process and download it? So it's, was the fear of death there? I assume obviously, but to what degree? And what was the spiritual journey like?
So I wanted a spiritual journey. I was expecting to have some sort of epiphany or something to happen, and or to kind of have some sort of, I don't know, like revelation of some sort. I don't know. And I'm not religious at all, but I definitely felt I felt like I was in a spiritual place in Antarctica. But I never felt afraid, and the Everest thing is interesting, but because statistically, it's true to say no one's ever died skiing to the South Pole. Quite a few people have died afterwards, or once they've gone and done something, the other side, or but actually, because obviously Scott was on his way back, he'd reached the South Pole, and then he was on his way back when his team died, and so no one's ever died skiing to the South Pole. So statistically, it's quite a safe expedition, and I'm also quite a risk-averse person, even though I love skydiving, I love sort of extreme adventure, if you like. It's always when you've kind of mitigated that risk to the lowest possible. You don't want to do anything foolhardy, but getting behind the wheel of a car is risky, right? So it's sort of managing that, how much risk you're kind of happy with. And when it comes to Seven Summits, I always said that I would never do Everest because I don't think it's worth that. But I can think it depends on who you go with and things like that. So it was a very kind of spiritual experience without any specific sort of thing. And in terms of the poles, there are many poles. So there's there's the geographic South Pole, the magnetic South Pole, the pole of inaccessibility, the pole of ignorance, and all these different things which I can tell you about later. But the geographic South Pole, if you stuck a pencil through an orange, it's the bit around which the Earth spins. So that's the kind of actual 90 degrees south.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi there. Just curious, when you said you couldn't ski, but you decided Antarctica was for you. So I'm just curious, why not the Amazon, or why not desert somewhere? What drew you specifically?
Yeah, I think for me it was a combination of things. So when you look at a world map, Antarctica is just a white blob at the bottom. You don't see it in its totality, and actually, it was called Terra Incognita until very recently. People didn't know very much about it, and it's still got this incredible draw of being kind of slightly unknown and unknowable. And so for me, that was kind of a huge part of it. It had to be Antarctica, and also the human history of Antarctica is very young, even though Antarctica is so old and kind of majestic, and people have only been there within the last 100 years or so, and the fact that there are people around now who are the sort of just two generations away from the original golden age of polar exploration, people who've maybe even met some of those people who are still around with us now, and that to me is incredible. You can kind of reach out and touch it within a generation or two. So it always had to be Antarctica, never kind of anything anywhere else. Right.
I've got this vision of you kissing the South Pole thing like a Dumb and Dumber expedition. You literally got stuck for days or something. I want to explore your legacy and the sort of inspiration. The numbers, the tiny numbers of people who've achieved the sort of thing that you've just done. And I just wonder how, the school trips you do, and the same with Lou, and a whole heap of other folk. I looked at this sort of global exploration thing through a slightly military lens. Just in Harry, but a mega climb Everest, double above the amputee. So there's something about a military mindset, but more specifically, I think, having listened to Preet Chandy last week talk about her 2 expeditions to the South Pole, there's this really tiny community of people who've achieved extraordinary things, and you maybe don't realise how extraordinary what you've done and others have done. But to the sort of normal people on the street, it genuinely is. And so your legacy and your inspiration into schools, is there an opportunity for a community of folk who are pretty tightly connected through their experiences and through the power to inspire, global movements almost, sort of this girl can, and, Brie was the first female person of colour to do what she did. Do you connect to each other? Are you still in a sort of isolation? Is this something that will happen once you've, got whatever's next off your chest, or how do you amplify that?
It's a great question, and I'd love to kind of think big in the same way as I've thought about expeditions, as how I can kind of use what I've done as a platform to kind of take that message wider and to inspire women and girls and women in midlife and all of those things. And the polar community is very small, so we do all know each other, but quite often it is just kind of, as with the expeditions themselves, it's 1 or 2 sort of going off and doing various talks at various places. But Adriana Brownlee, who's a British woman who's done a huge number of sort of high altitude mountains, and I are in touch talking about how we can actually do something that sort of is kind of what I think you're heading towards. But yeah, if anyone's got any ideas of how we can do that, then hit me up. Yeah.
I think this is a much sillier question, but what are you eating on these expeditions, and what meal were you craving and daydreaming about?
So every expedition account that you ever read, it talks about the weather, the morale, the distance covered, the food, and back to the weather again. So food is like not silly, it's kind of pretty central to expeditions, and getting that wrong can be bad in so many ways, So I was eating dried rations, which you then melt snow to rehydrate into a sort of, high level pot noodle, if you like. And they were pretty good. They were sort of 1,000 calories each, and I really liked the fish and potato pie. So kind of every day that I didn't have that, I was slightly disappointed. So for the second expedition, I just took fish and potato pie. It just takes another decision out of the equation, and makes life simpler. And then during the day, you don't stop to cook or anything like that. So you're eating just anything you can kind of get calories in on the move. So chocolate and nuts and dried fruit and cheese and sort of anything that you can kind of easily digest.
There's something I wanted to
You
bring
missed
up.
the second half of the question,
Yeah.
which is what you were really looking for.
Oh, what was I looking forward to?
Sorry,
Sorry. I didn't allow myself to kind of miss anything, because then you would just be torturing yourself the whole time. But as I got closer to Pole, when I was within 24 hours of the South Pole on the first journey, I really started thinking about tea and toast. It's like those simple things, just comfort food. And once I got to Pole, I literally couldn't stop eating. And so I'd lost 12 kilos on the first journey. And the body's an incredible thing. I just could not stop eating, to the extent that when I got back to the UK, I got off the train where I lived, and I had a 15-minute walk to get home, and I had to go to the cafe to get some food to get me home, because I was so worried about running out of food. And as soon as I got back to my sort of normal weight, if you like, I stopped being so ravenous. It was really weird. But yeah, it was sort of comfort food, tea and toast.
I've got a silly question. So when you get to the pole, somebody comes and picks you up, you don't turn around and go all the way back again?
Some people do kite back to save a bit of money, but I got a flight back, and that 42-day journey, the flight back's 4.5 hours. So,
Wow.
Sorry, Nick, you were going
Yeah, do you know what? I've completely forgotten. Oh no, I was going to bring up something that we've completely missed. Of course, maybe it could be the thing to finish on. But when we were doing our rehearsal over Zoom the other day, you told me some tricks that you would do to motivate yourself in the morning. I mean, you said earlier that you'd wake up crying, but there were things that you did that got you in the right frame of mind. I mean, for example, famously, David Hempelman Adams wrote the names of his daughters on his skis, didn't he? So that every step he took, he felt he was taking a step towards his
that's nice,
daughters.
Yeah.
But I was so interested in what you were saying about this that it'd be very nice if you would share it with the audience.
I had a sports psychologist for the second journey that I did, and we talked about mental coping strategies. And actually, some of the things that I did sort of just kind of I invented for myself on the first journey was the sorts of things that they would recommend people do. And it does come back to that, checking the time at the next hedge. A lot of it came down to sort of breaking the day down into as smaller parts as I needed to kind of keep going. So sometimes it was, at the end of the day, I'm going to treat myself to a bit of crystalline ginger, which was one of my top treats, or, I'm going to listen to a book that I've been looking forward to when I get to 10 days to go. And just even to the extent of sometimes it was, just take another 100 paces and then you can, I don't know, put an extra warm layer on or something. So sometimes it was as short as that, and sometimes it was sort of 10 days that I could kind of think in chunks of. And the fact that it was such a big sort of amount of mileage, if you think about it in its totality, that's when you start to go a little bit mad. You have to kind of break it down. So that was definitely one thing. And then in the mornings, regardless of whether I could see the sun or not, I would do this power pose to the sun. This is a power pose, and this is a power pose. And research shows that people who do power poses are more successful than people who don't. So I was just like, anything that I can kind of grab hold of to be like, I'm really glad that I'm still here, I'm still alive, I'm going to, it's going to be a great day. Whether it would, invariably it wasn't a great day, but, just doing those kinds of things. And I'd mark the days because they sort of started to blur into each other, and I could only tell which day it was from what was written on my food set. But I'd write, like when people are in prison, they do a tally of a little sort of gate. I was drawing a heart every day on the inside of my tent to try and make myself believe that I was sort of loving this existence. So I was literally clinging on to anything that I could kind of think of that might sort of just help me get to the next day or the next hour.
So I expect everybody tomorrow morning to do a power. I think probably you're going to lose your voice if you talk anymore. So shall we have one more question?
I think.
One very, I know I already spoke, apologies. How long did it actually take you to the run-up to prepare yourself for even the first expedition? Did it take 10 years, 5 years, 2 years? And then to couple on a second question is, theoretically, if I wanted to come with yourself or whoever else has traversed, or how long would that theoretically take? Do you have to have a special pass? You were saying earlier about you have to build up a CV or
almost, yeah.
That's a pretty hefty CV, but what does that actually?
And for me, it took 5 years, and the reason it took 5 years is because I had literally no experience and no money either. So getting sponsorship, which I think is probably a nice sort of point to end on, and getting sponsorship is almost as difficult as the journey itself. So to have sponsors like Thomas Pink who believe in you and then can come on that journey with you are absolutely critical to the process. If you've got money, you could probably do it from a standing start in 2 years, but you'd have to be very dedicated you need a lot of time as well to drag tyres around for training. You need to spend a lot of that time actually on expedition, gaining the relevant experience. But anything's achievable.
I think we have one final question.
To close this interview, I have a question. Who do you dedicate this journey to you, to yourself, to your kids, to your family? This journey has
definitely to my kids, because although I haven't mentioned them a lot, they're the thing I'm most proud of in my whole life. The expeditions are one thing, but my kids are amazing, and they've always supported me on any of these the crazy things that I want to do. They've never kind of said you shouldn't go for this reason or that reason. They've come out on training trips. They've put aside so much of their own holiday time, all sorts of things to support me. So definitely that was what I was thinking about when I was thinking about getting home. It was to see them.
Would you join me in thanking Wendy for a fantastic